Shortly after that, I got introduced to Kubernetes. And I don't want to say it was love at first sight, but it was pretty darn close. I really like the simplicity. I'm a very simplistic person. If it's overcomplicated and it's over-engineered, people just didn't understand the problem well enough, in my opinion. So when I looked at Kubernetes, I was like, okay, so something simple. You pass it in, you execute, it dies. That's the way things should be looking like.
Hello and welcome to Committing to Cloud Native, the podcast where we talk about the confluence of open source and cloud native infrastructure. Our panelists today are Justin Dorfman and Tzury Bar-Yochai, and they're going to have an awesome conversation. I really enjoyed listening to it with Chris Ferreira. Chris is joining us today from Austin, Texas. He's the principal engineer and architect for the WebEx Platform at Cisco. And I really hope you enjoy this conversation. Take it away, Tzury.
Hello, Chris. How are you today?
I'm good, and yourself?
Hey, Chris. Great. Hey, Justin.
Hey, Tzury.
So today we have Chris here. Chris, our friend from Cisco. And before we're going to jump into our short story, which is Curiefense, we would love to hear Chris' history in the IT world. And he got a bunch of great stories, which when I heard them back in the day in London when we met, about a year and a half ago, I was fascinated. And I hope he'll share some of those with us today.
Chris, I want to hear what's your background? Where'd you come from and how have you built your career?
I have a bit of an unorthodox background, I think is probably the best way to put it. When I actually went to college, I went for culinary school and I went to become a chef. So that's kind of where my discipline and my rigor, I think, originate from, because of the way you kind of operate in the kitchen is almost like a militant style. But, I did, go to obviously the IT world because I had spent a good amount of time in my youth and I always had a knack for it. And I bounced around in a couple of startups to begin with. And the startup story was pretty awesome because it was never boring. We got to wear a different hat every day and you had to take on a different role every day. And by doing that, I got to fill up my trivia pursuit pie, if you will, of knowledge. And I got to work on the front end. I got to work in the back end. And then I started to kind of look into platform. But, the last startup that I was at was a company called Parature, which was a CRM product. And we were completely cloud. Now, we run our own data centers in CenturyLink. And we had components at the time in AWS. AWS was pretty much the only cloud provider around then. It was really kind of getting off, it was around and so on. And we started doing cloud before Azure was a thing. Google Cloud was even around. And we did pretty well for a CRM product. And we were always punching above our weight class, working with companies like IBM and Nintendo and stuff like that. So it was a really cool experience. However, one day we all come into the office and there's about 20 people there. And we're like, who are these people? And obviously the announcement came out that we were being acquired by Microsoft. And at first, everyone was like, whoa, what's going on here? We're a startup. Why do we want to go to big tech? And there were people there for sure that were at the startup because they wanted to be startup. And there were folks that were pretty excited about the acquisition with Microsoft. Now, Microsoft was at the time still in the Steve Ballmer era before Satya came in and kind of you get that.
Developers.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was an interesting to come into. And shortly after the acquisition was actually when Satya began to become CEO of Microsoft and Steve Ballmer stepped down. But, the culture change that Satya brought in took a little bit of time to reach all perimeters of the company. And when I first got there, when I went out to Redmond for the first time, and I had this Apple computer, and I work at Microsoft during the Steve Ballmer, you get a couple of, head turns like, what the F? It's okay.
That's the culture he built.
That's correct.
Like if you had an iPhone, he would throw it against the wall. But anyway.
I can't even tell you how many Windows phones I saw during that time. And I was certainly still an Apple ecosystem kind of guy. So I was always an oddball from the moment I arrived. And while some folks would adapt to that culture, I didn't feel the need. So I've always kind of stayed true. I've always been super stubborn. So I just always used whatever I thought worked. And that's what kind of got me going at Microsoft, to be honest with you. At the time, Azure was starting up. Azure was painful, I think is probably the best way to put it. It wasn't very intuitive. Some components were not necessarily easy to work with. And we were trying to design at the time a CRM portal, which is the Dynamics CRM product. And we wanted to run it in Azure, and we were having so much pain and difficulties in that area. And we worked through it. We worked with the Azure team, and I'm not going to go into every detail, but it was a hectic process. We did some crazy stuff. For instance, one time we tried to upgrade all of the CRM portals in Europe, and apparently we took up like 80% of Azure's compute in Europe. So they didn't quite enjoy that, and they did get on the line with us pretty quickly. And kind of some of the folks in charge of that area, some really talented people that I worked with over at Parature, kind of had to put in mechanisms to protect that from ourselves. And we did lots of other crazy things along that time. And we were in the frontier, right? But we were kind of starting things. And at the time, Kubernetes was a whisper in the background, and we were still doing VM-based infrastructure. We were using Microsoft Service Fabric at the time, and it was okay. But shortly after that, I got introduced to Kubernetes. And I don't want to say it was love at first sight, but it was pretty darn close. I really liked the simplicity. I'm a very simplistic person. If it's overcomplicated and it's over-engineered, people just didn't understand the problem well enough, in my opinion. So when I looked at Kubernetes, I was like, okay, so something simple. You pass it in, you execute, it dies. That's the way things should be looking like. And I adapted to it pretty quickly, and I became a code contributor to the open source community. And I did a whole lot of things for Microsoft in that area for a good amount of time until I'd say around 2017-ish. I get wind of this product that was being developed by Google and IBM and the folks over at Lyft in Istio. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, okay, I see what they're trying to do here. And it's what every company always strives to do, but in some way or another, we always kind of screw it up somewhere. If we miss an execution step, if we miss a specific task in a specific area, and we end up like DDoSing ourselves as we scale. The service mesh wasn't really a defined term. I mean, there were things out there. There was Linkerd and other components that were out there, but they didn't do everything they were advertised to do. And I started kind of looking into this Istio thing. And this was around the 0.6, 0.7 timeframe. 1.0, I think, came out a couple of months later, and started working with that, started tinkering with that, looking at that for different components in the Microsoft Cloud and AI group. And I brought that in-house, and I brought it up to a GM at the time. And I said, look, I like what we do here. However, I think we can do better. And I would like to kind of do POC to put the platform into Kubernetes, into microservices. So I was embracing Linux at the time. .NET Core had just been released, so we could run our code in Linux and do everything we were trying to do. So I was like, why not? I made the pitch, and I'm not going to call out names, but it was too soon. Timing is everything. Folks were not ready to switch away from VM-based infrastructure straight into microservices. And the response I got was, no one's ever moved a multi-billion-dollar ARR business into microservices. He was probably correct. I'm not going to lie. But like I said before, I'm pretty stubborn. So I went over to a group that was like, yeah, we're into that kind of stuff. Let's cut our teeth and get this going. And I went over there and I joined that group. This was the Dynamics AX, Dynamics 365 group. And we were building like ERP solutions and other components. And we started tinkering with Linux containers, doing code check-ins and doing things in the Kubernetes infrastructure and implementing the Istio service mesh with the Envoy proxy, handling communication paths and so on and so forth. And it was just fun. It was just a good time. We started doing things faster and we just got better. And certain components that were built in the legacy way, to process them because they were on a single VM, were taking like over a day to finish. And when we actually introduced those same components into horizontal pod autoscale, being able to scale out the compute resource and memory resources, we took down the day of processing to get to an output. We took it down to minutes. And when it finally came to customers, we're kind of blown away, right? So something that used to take them a day to get an output, now it took them minutes to get an output. And that's just one example of kind of what it brought. And we became code contributors to Istio in a pretty big way. Azure started to adopt it. A lot of Azure at the time was actually adopting Linux underneath the hood, where everything prior had been nothing but Microsoft. So
Windows XP.
I mean,
I'm joking.
yeah. I mean, XP was a good one. XP was a good one. We can't knock XP. That
XP was my favorite. Yeah, wait. For sure. XP was my favorite operating system when I used Windows. For sure.
I would say NT4 is my favorite one, and that's it.
You would NT4. Yeah, no. We could throw away 2000. We can definitely throw away Windows 8, and some of those probably could have been skipped over, but XP was pretty good. I have no knocks on that. And server was okay. It kind of did its job. And
2003.
Yeah. Server was good. But when we made the switch over and we saw how things were going, and it became like a wave, and the wave started to build up. And as you actually saw the resources that were dedicated at the time to Microsoft Service Fabric, which they made open source, the community didn't rally to it. So Microsoft saw it and was like, okay, well, if they're not going to rally to us, we're going to rally to them. And then became big contributors, and all the resources that were on Service Fabric were kind of swapped over to different things. A lot of them were reallocated to the work in AKS, the Azure Kubernetes service. And that's kind of when it all started to kind of really shift over there. And it took time, and it's still going on from what I understand. I still, speak to folks over there occasionally, and there's still a whole lot of transition still going on, but it was no more, it's only Microsoft. We can only use Microsoft. It was, okay, let's use what works. And if it's Microsoft, sure. If it's not Microsoft, okay. And make sure that we make sure our customers are the priority and not the technologies we use underneath. And it was great. It was great. But then someone came knocking on my door over here in Cisco.
What made you want to leave this like rocket ship to go to another company? Because I mean, it's got to be kind of hard, because Microsoft in the past decade has done some amazing things. Like Microsoft technologies I use every day is VS Code and GitHub. It's just like, there's such a big force in this industry. It had to be more than money to get you over there. What was it that made you go, yeah, I need to go?
It really wasn't money. And actually, I said no a bunch of times before I said yes. It's for all transparency. I liked what I was doing. I liked where things were going. However, an opportunity came over here in Cisco and was like, look, we want to run not just in one cloud. We want to run in every cloud. And I knew that if I stayed at Microsoft, I was going to kind of be Azure centric, because you kind of have to eat your own dog food. So Azure centric was always the way it was going to be. So upon the discussions and the capabilities that folks over here offered me to kind of pivot a lot of the stuff they were doing into a place they were willing to explore and willing to take bets on, kind of got me excited. So I did it. I made the move. So I left rainy Seattle, which I still love. No knock on Seattle. My kids grew up there, and I certainly do appreciate the Washington area. But I was given an option where to go, and I chose the place that has the exact opposite weather of Seattle in Austin. Nothing but hot and dry all summer versus the soggy Seattle 9 months of the year. So I showed up here over at Cisco, and I was given kind of the keys to the kingdom from a platform perspective for the WebEx contact center. Now, this wasn't a market that had huge amounts of competition, but there was some pretty good competitors in it for sure. However, where they were was they were provisioning it in physical data centers. They were building out data centers, and geographic expansion would take months to do, to stand up a single data center. So they wanted to start leveraging public cloud. How do we do that? So I went there, and you can ask all the teammates. I showed up, and well, the morale was not the greatest because they kind of had been spinning their wheels, not really getting far. But the first day I showed up, which was June 24th, 2019, and it sticks out in my head every day. And I showed up and I said, look, I realized you guys have had some tough times before I arrived, and my arrival may or may not help you. But look, I'll make a deal with y'all. If you guys give me 6 months to kind of turn some stuff around, we're going to do it. But if I can't do it, I will give you all the power to have a vote, and I will resign literally 6 months from this day.
That's some accountability.
Yeah. I feel everyone should have a skin in the game. If you don't have skin in the game, then why trust the person? And trust is critical to me and the people I work with. So the first thing I asked was, look, we have too much manual touch in production. By March, I want no hands ever touching production ever again. The second, I want to put us in a public cloud provider. I don't want to be building physical data centers, especially with the VM-based infrastructure. So that's kind of the shift they were trying to get to. However, maybe I was able to be a catalyst to kind of accelerate that particular element. And so a couple of months later, we took all hands out of production. We automated and built out data centers in the public cloud. We went down from a 6-7 month time frame down to right around 60 minutes. So obviously a huge shift. In hindsight, it looked like a genius move. I'm not sure I would definitely call it a genius move, but obviously COVID arrived and we had to start scaling up the contact center in pretty large proportions. So we were actually able to scale out the contact center about 500% in right around 8 days. Right around 8 days. So it was a pretty big shift pretty quickly. It was trial by fire for sure.
Wow. That's a big jump.
Yeah. And we put the right tools in place that we could kind of track our capacity in a better way, which allowed us to do that expansion so quickly. And throughout the early days of COVID, Cisco was trying to be there and help however we could. Contact center was going to be a big component. We were trying to help, healthcare providers and governments and stuff like that, kind of make sure that when people had issues, they could reach out to the individuals that could provide them the right information to guide them. And I think the entire team kind of rallied around that. And it wasn't even an ask. Like, we all said, it's going to take a little bit of extra to do this, but we all understand what's at play here. So I was really proud of the group I was working with because they didn't even bat an eye. It was not even a blink. It was just, let's go get it done. And we did.
Would you classify Cisco as a hybrid architecture, or have you just shut down all the data centers and said, we're going 100%?
No, I don't believe a full public cloud strategy is always the right thing for the right application. So I think Cisco's always going to be a hybrid cloud. I don't see why they wouldn't want to be, especially since Cisco builds most of our network switches and all the components that run in the data centers anyway. So why not leverage what greatness you have at Cisco and leverage the burstability and scalability you can achieve with the public cloud? So I think Cisco's always going to be in that hybrid mode because it just makes the most sense. Work with our partners, work with other cloud service providers, and build our data centers, because if anyone's going to know how to troubleshoot networking issues, should be Cisco. So let's kind of leverage what we do good.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of cloud providers would be too happy if Cisco went into the cloud computing space, because it's like they have all of your routers and, it would just be terrible. But I like that approach, though, of this. And I think that's kind of where a lot of shops should definitely look at, is the hybrid approach rather than just going all in on one cloud and then they're stuck.
Yeah. And right before COVID, I went over to London, sync up with my security architect over at the contact center. And I met this guy with this crazy beard here. And
yeah, you're talking about me.
Yeah, I'm talking about you, sir. And I'm sitting in the Bedfont Lakes office, and Tzury is giving me his sales pitch. And I love salesy stuff because I'm not exactly the best at fluff, very direct. And I had a time to look at the Reblaze product and what it did. However, when we sat down with Tzury and he showed me what they did, and he had this is a compliment, don't take it as a negative. He had a twinkle in his eye, is probably the best analogy I could put with that you could believe he actually cared about what he was doing. Now, some folks, they sell you things and it's just, okay, it's a thing to them. But for Tzury, it felt like this is a passion. This is what he does. And This is what he wants to do. And I was like, look, I like you. I like your technology. However, the implementation of it does not fit what I'm trying to do over here at Cisco. I'm trying to go to At the time, while we were doing all that cloud automation stuff, we were building out a new platform that was from scratch, completely microservice based, handles horizontal parallel scaling. Workloads are basically agnostic to cloud so that you can run on any cloud service provider or in our Cisco data centers. And I was like, I like your product, but it doesn't fit what I need. So literally, I think it was literally that afternoon that we sat down and like drew on like a napkin, basically, how I could see the Reblaze product and the stuff that they did over there becoming this thing that kind of would kind of invent how people think of web application firewall. Instead of being an extra hop in the communication path or being kind of hung up in the LB, we were able to, well, we did some crazy stuff to begin with. I'm not going to lie there. We were watching what was going on with Istio. We were seeing what was going on with Envoy. And we started an idea and we began iterations of that idea. And then I think a couple months later, I was sitting at the Google campus and I was sitting down with the product managers over at Istio. And I was like talking through the roadmap, talking through what we were trying to do. And at the time, they were trying to get away from a model that added extra complexity to the communication strategy between the proxy and the control plane. So they were removing components from the service mesh that we had originally thought we could depend on to be where we could plug in Curiefense. And we went through it, and then we were starting to look at proxy filters. We were looking at some of the WebAssembly stuff that they were trying to get towards, and Tzury and the folks over there, they were crazy enough to take a chance on it and make that bet. And I mean, I'm sure so glad that they did. I think it's kind of defined a new frontier. WAF doesn't have to be this overbearing, heavy component that you have to run into your infrastructure that adds extreme amounts of latency. It can become a security filter in the entire communication path. It becomes so much more lightweight, so much more effective as far as the way your services run internally in the cluster and the way things come into the cluster as well from outside. And by having this capability to keep everything within your own trust boundary and not have to, offload to elsewhere and go over the open internet. And even with encrypted traffic, you never know what you're susceptible to across the open internet. We can all admit that it's the Wild West out there. So if we can rein it in and clean it up and not have to worry about extenuating circumstances, it just became so valuable. And it had some bumps. I won't lie. It had some bumps at the beginning, but it's really kind of evolved. And the folks over at Reblaze they made themselves available to us to kind of work through these obstacles that just made it that much better. And I'll forever be grateful to Tzury and his team over at Reblaze for that, because they took a chance on some crazy ass guy from Texas to do something that nobody was even thinking about yet.
If I may share an observation from my end while listening to these stories you shared with us, I would say you're a man of transformation, if I may. So think about that. You got this Microsoft, decades in the industry, trying their way in the internet and literally failing with the players, with the browsers, with all sort of strategies. And it seems like Azure was the platform that took Microsoft, brought them into the game and made them into this, frontier and futuristic company. So for me, you were right there in the right place in the right time to contribute to this transition. Then I'm looking at Cisco. Sequoia Capital invested in Cisco. When was it? Like 80s, 70s? When was it? The company who invented the routers, right? TCP/IP was at the beginning. Cisco basically started the internet from infrastructure perspective. And cloud, the more cloud became popular and taking off, companies such as Cisco and others who rely mostly on appliances and hardware really needed to redefine themselves, redefine the strategy and readjust. And it seems like Cisco is playing a significant role in the cloud even today. Just looking at acquisitions recent years like Duo, PortShift, and others. Do you mind sharing a little bit about Cisco strategy in the cloud space?
So everybody kind of knows the Duo stuff. And the office that I actually sit here in Austin is actually the original Duo office down here in Austin. So yeah, I'm very familiar with that group. Cisco's strategy in the cloud has been strategic, right? You see certain acquisitions that have been done. They're all very specific purposes. And when I look at WebEx, because that's where I am now, and I have a lot of familiarity with a lot of the recent acquisitions of Voicea, Babel Labs, and other components. As they wanted to get into the cloud and as they wanted to enhance the telepresence components, they knew that we can build things and we will build things, but there are other things out there that they do the job. And if we get those components and we add a bit more of that muscle that the company has behind it, we can make them that much better. And that's kind of what I saw with the acquisition specifically of Voicea. Getting that assistant into the WebEx platform that takes all your meeting notes and sends you an email at the end of the meeting with all your meeting notes. So you didn't need someone to be sitting there typing everything down. That's a huge value, especially if you're in a COVID world where all your meetings are basically happening over a telepresence like this. So that one in particular sits at home because not only did the founder of that company become the GM of the contact center, and I have immense amounts of respect for him and the group that helped build Voicea, but the product kind of enabled what Cisco's overall vision of WebEx was to become. And now that we have G2 coming over from Box and other things, there's a real fire that's going on right now. And you can kind of feel it. It's a big shift. And it reminds me a bit of what happened when Satya came into Microsoft. Well, not when he came into, he was always there, but when he became CEO of Microsoft, it was, okay, we've reached a point. We know what we are. We want to be this now. So let's fire on all cylinders to get to that. And it's exciting. It's always exciting. And does everything go smoothly? Not a chance. I don't think it ever will. But the transformation that is going on daily and the feelings that are behind it are just a lot of energy. And really, I appreciate that kind of environment. I love energy. I love fight. And I love people that are kind of willing to take chances.
Well, the third transformation I didn't mention was transformation of Reblaze, that you played a major role in, Chris. And we're grateful for that.
I just drew on a napkin, and I don't know. I drew on a napkin, how I could see it. But you all really did it. I mean, we had an original idea, then we had a second idea, we had a third idea. I think we ended up with a pretty good one around 7 or 8. But, the folks over at Reblaze, I'm telling you, when we ever had an issue, literally, they would be up to all hours of the night. And I didn't want them to do this, but I don't think I could stop them even if I tried. They'd be up to all hours of the night working through it, and by the next morning, it'd be fixed. I mean, how can you not appreciate that kind of passion and that kind of commitment? So it was pretty easy for me to be okay with that, Tzury, even though I would have told you all, you guys should sleep. It'd probably be good. You probably want to spend a little bit of time with your families, not with just your code, but they were dedicated to kind of the revolution that needed to take place in the space. And I was pretty excited about it.
Definitely. Highly appreciate it, Chris. I believe we will talk a lot about that soon, but you mentioned families, time with families. Before COVID, I remember you being traveling probably 70% of the time. Wasn't it the case? How did you adjust? Staying at home in Austin, next to a famous neighborhood. Not mentioning names, obviously.
I love it. Yeah. I love every minute of it. I have little kids. Being home with them is always different. And being here with my wife is the rock that allows me to do these things. I couldn't do any of this stuff without her. And she's the key piece to all the good stuff that has happened. She enables me to be able to travel to India, to London, to California, to Boston, to wherever I am. I know she's got it on lock at home. And it's just been a blessing. It's been a blessing and a curse. COVID itself is a very sad, horrible thing. But being home for the last year has been one of the more, that's the silver lining in the black clouds that I've experienced over the last year. Has been being at home with the kids and spending time with them more and spending time with my family.
Another question I have for you, Chris, is I know that you hate management layers. your personality and your style. I think you said it yourself. Now, when we look at what we call cloud native, Kubernetes, Istio, and this entire ecosystem, you meet tons of layers of software and configuration management and one on top of another before you get to the actual application code. The application code is what, 20% of the code base running in real time, 30%, but it seems to be to take off anyhow. What's your take on it?
Yeah, like I said, I'm not a fluff guy. So layers add complexity. So what I typically like to do is strip it down to bare bones and iteratively build, but make sure that we're building in a way that we're looking at the holistic picture. While the application layer may only be 20, 30% of the code base, I want to always be thinking about how does that application work with the hardware? How does that application work with the orchestration behind it? For example, everyone has Android and iOS phones. iOS phones from a hardware perspective are significantly underpowered compared to the specs you see in an Android device. But for some reason, iOS destroys Android in most benchmark cases. It's because the software is built for the hardware. And that simplification, that unison that's designed into it, if you take that into account in the way you build through those layers, you end up with something pretty remarkable, and you can do more with less. And coming from startup world, I didn't grow up in big tech and the billion-dollar budgets. I grew up in startups and, we can't afford to do that, so find a cheaper way to make it happen. And I still have that frugalness when it comes to how I design and implement. Now, do I take a couple of $1 million shortcuts sometimes? Sure, there's no doubt. However, if I can avoid it, I'm always certainly willing. And cloud native has been one of the critical pieces to getting some of the things we have done recently. And it has allowed us to do so much more than we ever have before with so much less. It's just been incredible. Open source community is just so incredible. And you can't really think of industries that have this kind of community around it. People just contributing to a single component that is used by all. How often do you actually see that in verticals? You don't, right? There's always some business agenda in the way communities work in other verticals, but in this industry, the agenda is just to make it work and make it work better. And that has been one of the critical, amazing pieces that I've kind of been blessed to be with the last couple of years.
What do you think is the reason actually tech industry is the one who introduced probably to the world the open source concept, sharing and collaborating across even so many cases our competitors from different companies, right? Why is tech is the pioneer of this phenomena?
Because we're crazy. We're crazy to begin with. We're in tech. That was a dumb idea. No, I mean, I always come back to the methodology that, someone told me a couple of years back that there's the 4 no's. And I think that the tech industry gets it the best. You know what you don't know. Sometimes you don't know what you know. And there are definitely cases where you don't know what you don't know. And having that humility and having that understanding kind of enables tech to do these sorts of things.
I would say it also has to do with the geeks that they can have the community. But yeah.
The geeks help. And I'm a huge nerd. So I'll be perfectly honest. I'm probably one of the biggest nerds in the world. I'll play video games with my kids. I'll watch Star Wars. It's fine. I'm proud of it. I own it. I'm a geek and I'm good with it.
So back to Curiefense, Chris, if I may, we're planning to release in a few months the entire AI-based platform or automatic analysis, detection, prevention, and so on. We're also looking into integrating with other wings and operations within Cisco, the threat intelligence company. So we're looking into integrating with their threat feeds. Curiefense will be synchronized with those feeds in real time and so on. Are there features, capabilities that you would love to see in Curiefense? Because your demand is our command.
So security in Cisco is not a P1 or a P2. It is a P0 with an exclamation point. And it's really important that a company that does networking, that does hardware in certain ways, security is the fundamental base of everything that Cisco does. And in the container space, it does get a bad rap sometimes from a security perspective. And if you can add that blanket of security that Curiefense provides, it definitely helps me sleep at night. And I'm sure it definitely helps others that are on call 24/7, not getting phone calls in the middle of the night because of a security threat or because of a DDoS or something like that. So yeah, security is fundamental here, and everything we do is focused around it. So,
and that's it. Thank you so much, Chris, for being on the podcast. Thank you, Justin and Tzury, for holding the conversation together and being amazing people. Listeners, I hope you enjoyed this one. Do tune in next time. We're really excited about our lineup of guests. We have a super exciting guest next week. Can't wait to share him with you. As well, check out the show notes for this podcast at https:// those are forward slashes, not backslashes, podcast.curiefense.io. That's CURIEFENSE. Podcast.curiefense.io for the Commuting to Cloud Native podcast. You could also just use Google. But either way, thanks again for listening. Tune in next week. Catch you later.